Well, good evening, everyone. My name's John Highbush. I have the honor of being the executive director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. I just want to thank all of you for coming out this evening. In honor of our men and women who defend our freedom around the world, if you'd please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. I am particularly pleased to be here to welcome back to the Reagan Library our special guests this evening, Speaker Newt Gingrich and his wife Callista. I have no doubt that when most of you see Speaker Gingrich, you more likely than not best remember him in his historic role as a Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. A strategic thinker and experienced hand who was the architect of the contract with America, he led the fight when the Republicans captured a majority of the U.S. House in 1994. It was the first time Republicans controlled the gavel in 4 decades. No doubt you'll also remember him as Times Man of the Year in 1995, and also as the true legislative genius he was in bringing about welfare reform, tax cuts, and a balanced federal budget. Think of that, a balanced federal budget during his time as Speaker. When I see Speaker Gingrich, it's through somewhat of a different lens. I see a younger, more brazen, more impatient, and more revolutionary foot soldier turned general during the Reagan Revolution of the 1980s. I have fond memories of working on Capitol Hill at that time, watching Congressman Newt Gingrich of Georgia emerge from the back benches of the democratically controlled House. He understood and seized the opportunity President Reagan brought to the whole Republican Party and the entire nation in its effort to remake itself as a shining city on a hill. And I recall at the time, it was not only Democrats, but some Republicans as well, who wondered aloud whether President Reagan's ideas were too bold or just too much too soon. President Reagan pressed on, as you all know, and implemented his historic program to reduce the size of federal government, to cut tax rates for all, to deregulate the economy so freedom could ring, and reinvest in our vital national security. Newt Gingrich, wise far beyond his years, helped make the Reagan Revolution a reality, and for all of that, we should be grateful. Tonight, he brings to us a new book, Duplicity, which is an exciting venture for him given it's a Washington thriller. It may read like fiction, but given the historical events of our day and Newt's imagination, where he is constantly ahead of the curve, he writes on a topic where we find life often now imitating art. With Newt tonight is the other important half of his life, his business, his love, and his future, Callista Gingrich. She, too, has become a well-known author for her New York Times best-selling series of children's books that attempt what most such books rarely do, and that is to teach important lessons on American history to our youth. She has with her tonight a 5th in her series, but as the president of Gingrich Productions, she is also a first-rate businesswoman with TV and documentary production experience, marketing, photographic, voiceover, musical, and vocal talents that make her a true standout in each of these fields. The Gingriches, well, they are like family here at the Reagan Library. They are always welcome at the home of Ronald Reagan, and we look forward to having them here time and time again. Ladies and gentlemen, if you would, please join me in welcoming to the stage the first half of Gingrich and Gingrich, former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich.
Well, that was certainly more than generous on John's part. Callista and I always love coming here. It is an extraordinary shrine, if you will, to the idea of America, the idea of freedom, and the idea that leadership makes an enormous difference. And I know how big a difference it can make because I was there as a freshman in 1979-80 under Jimmy Carter, and then in 1981 as Ronald Reagan came in. And it's a true story. I may have told the story before, and I think certainly your team knows it very well, John, but it was symbolic that as the inaugural began in 1981, and Jimmy Carter was there to say farewell, the skies were cloudy, and as Reagan was introduced, almost as though Cecil B. DeMille had shaped it, the clouds parted, the sun came out, the sky was blue. And as the president began an extraordinary inaugural address, which if you've never taken the time to read it, I really recommend to you, really reshaping America, reminding us of our optimism, reminding us of our patriotism, reminding us of all the things that the Carter years had forgotten. As he was speaking, sitting up there at the Capitol behind him, I noticed that people were gossiping, and the word was being spread. And I wondered, right in the middle of the president's inaugural address. And what they were saying was, and it finally got to me, as a sophomore member, I was fairly far back, so I tend to get the news later than most of the conference. What they were saying was that the American hostages had left Iranian airspace. So that literally during his inaugural, the world was changing. Now, this was partially because the Reagan team had communicated with sincerity to the Iranians that they were not inclined to go along with this stuff. But it was partially because the Iranians just hated Carter. And they had wanted to make his life miserable. And they figured when he was gone, that game was over, so why not give up the hostages? And it just captured this moment, though. I mean, here's Jimmy Carter, America at bay, 444 days of hostages. Here's Ronald Reagan, 15 minutes into his term. The hostages are released. One of our major foreign policy problems is gone. And that gave you a flavor. Many of you know that the F-14 that's outside is another symbol of Reagan's leadership qualities, which I think really, and I learned a great deal about being a leader from working with, studying, and being near Ronald Reagan. And we had been through this period of timidity, a little bit like the current administration, but not as bad. And so the Navy came and said to the president that Gaddafi and Libya had said that the Gulf of Sidra was now Libyan waters and that there was a line of death, and if any Americans crossed the line of death, they'd be killed. And Reagan said to the Navy, well, what do you think? And they said, well, that's pretty stupid because the truth is they can't touch us and we can wipe them out. And he said, okay, and then they proposed to him that we would fly across this line and allow the Libyans to come out and try to shoot us down. And they came out, we shot a couple of Libyan airplanes down. And the next day, the Washington Press Corps, which in the tradition of the late 70s was just, hyper. I mean, oh my God, these planes were shot down and there was danger and American pilots might have been hurt. And they said to the president, did they wake you when this happened? And he said, no, we have an agreement. We shoot them down, I sleep. They shoot us down, wake me. Now, I'm not sure that was true, but he was sending a signal to the Soviets that he was calm, he was confident, he was willing to use power. And it was a major turning point in the Soviet understanding of what was possible during the Cold War. Now, Callista and I want to recognize one person who's here because we're so proud to be a partner with him. Kevin Knobloch, take a bow, is our director. And we've done 8 films together now, one of which was Ronald Reagan, Rendezvous with Destiny. And there was a part, and it's a terrific film because, you know, the truth is, you put Reagan on screen for 90 minutes, it's a good film. I mean, we don't have to be that great as filmmakers, just don't mess him up. But towards the end, we have part of his farewell address, in which he specifically talks about the importance of American history and his very deep concern that we are no longer teaching American history. And so Callista and I have undertaken a couple of projects that are designed to meet that need. One is her Ellis the Elephant series, which is designed to allow 4 to 8-year-olds to learn about American history from a little elephant, Ellis, who's actually named for Ellis Island, where Callista's grandmother came through in 1908. And it's really designed to let kids learn facts without them being warped and rewritten and reshaped by political correctness. And it's designed so that they're fun, that all these things rhyme. And to be honest, but it takes her, to do a fold out of 2 pages, takes her about as much time as for me to write a chapter. Because the facts have to be right, the words have to be appropriate for a 4 to 8-year-old, and they have to rhyme. And you go through all that stuff, and I mean, it is intricate. It's a little bit like watchmaking. It's, you know, whereas I just, you know, write, and hopefully it works. So we're very proud of that. We also are right in the middle of shooting a film with Kevin as a director on George Washington. And we have an entire social media project on why George Washington matters. And the reason we picked Washington is that for 200 and some years, we have, almost everybody in this room would understand that if I said father of the country, that I was talking about George Washington. That he really was first in war, first in peace, and first in the heart of his countrymen. That he was the anchor upon which we did everything. Now, we were up last week at Valley Forge, for example, and you look at that long winter, and you look at the creation of the modern American army which occurred there. Wouldn't have happened without Washington. You go down to Washington's Crossing, where he crossed on Christmas night to surprise the Hessians at Trenton. Wouldn't have happened without Washington. He personally imposed that campaign because none of his generals had the courage to do it. So again, you see Washington through the whole process. We were very privileged to go up and watch Kevin shooting. We have a George Washington and Martha Washington who are in the film, and they were filming Washington at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, where he both is picked to be the commanding general for the American forces in the Revolution, and then he comes back, that's in 1775, then he comes back 12 years later and becomes president of the Constitutional Convention. So all of these pieces make Washington central to who we are. And Callista was showing, she was on Fox and Friends one morning, and they had, to set up her Ellis the Elephant book, they had somebody out on the street interviewing people. And they got to one young woman and they said, you know, who was Washington? And she said, well, I think he was president. Wasn't he right after Lincoln? And to both of us, that was sort of the decisive moment where he sort of said, you know, recapturing Washington and reimplanting him in the hearts and minds of the American people is a really worthy project. So we're very deeply involved with Kevin on that. And I think it's in the tradition of Reagan's farewell address that both the books with Ellis and the movies fit this goal of how do we reestablish America with our own history and our own sense of what's made us unique. Now, Duplicity is a little different. And I will tell all of you that when I started to write this novel in June of 2013 with Pete Earley, who's been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, has been a Washington Post reporter, is a leading advocate of mental health reform, a really, really terrific person to work with. When we sat down and we began talking about doing this, it's a terrorism politics thriller that weaves things together. We had no idea in June of 2013 that the book would come out the week or the month that Secretary Clinton would be testifying in front of the Benghazi committee. So that's a little bit of a parallel that's beyond anything we imagine. But we wanted to establish 3 principles in the book educationally. And the book's not a textbook. It's a novel, and it moves very, very fast and has lots of action scenes. But we first want to get across the idea that terrorism is worldwide. The minute somebody starts describing the anti-terrorist campaign geographically, you know they're wrong. So if they talk to you about Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan or Yemen, they're just wrong. Because it's a worldwide phenomenon, much closer to epidemiology. It's a virus. It spreads on the internet. And it is religiously impelled, but it involves attracting people into a very different mindset. So we wanted to get that across. Second, we wanted to get across the idea that when politicians subordinate national security to politics, they run really big risks. You know, if you make a mistake in domestic policy, you may have slightly more unemployment or a slightly bigger deficit. You make a mistake in foreign policy, people can get killed. And so it's very dangerous when you start playing politics with national security. And third, we wanted to communicate that both individuals and institutions lie when they're under pressure. So if you're in a presidential campaign and you've made a big mistake and your choice is to tell the truth and lose the election, or try to find a way to not quite tell the truth and therefore win the election, the pressure on a political figure to not tell the truth is enormous. And if the president doesn't tell the truth, then the pressure on the Central Intelligence Agency to not tell the truth in order to support the president who's not telling the truth becomes enormous. And now you got the CIA lying to Congress on behalf of covering up for the president. So we weave all those together, and to give you a sense of how complicated it gets, we have a very patriotic Somali American in Minneapolis who was running for Congress. And his brother went in the other direction and is the #2 leader of al-Shabaab, the terrorist organization in Mogadishu. So imagine the tension in the family between the guy who wants to destroy America and the guy who wants to represent America. And imagine, in terms of duplicity, the desire of the candidate in Minneapolis not to let the press know who his brother is, because it would probably make his campaign impossible. And so that's where it all begins, and I think you'll find it a very fascinating kind of book. And our hope is that it will help you see behind the headlines and help you see behind the daily stories and get a sense of the rhythm of where we're at. I'm very, very concerned. I have an article which is coming out tomorrow morning in the Washington Times about the arguing that we are not safe. And arguing that the recent argument between Jeb Bush and Donald Trump is exactly irrelevant, because we don't need to argue over 2001 to 2009. What we really need to know from these candidates is, what are you going to do now? Because we have spent 14 years, we've had 6,800 Americans killed, about 50,000 wounded. We've spent $1.6 trillion, and we're not winning. And we need a national debate about how do we turn this around. Now, I watched the other night, and Cliff and I did watch the Reagan Library debate. Brought back fond memories of an earlier debate I participated in out here. And then we watched the other night the debate that CNN had with the Democrats. And part of the challenge we have when people talk to me about how do you get along and all that, if you watch these debates, you're watching two different planets. I mean, you look at the Republican debates and the Republican attitudes, the Republican candidates, then you look at the Democrats. They're really that profoundly different now. And it's as though they have moved apart further and further over the last 20 or 25 years. And it's really a very profound thing. And it's one that we're going to have to, as a country, come to grips with presently, because we're drifting towards Lincoln's warning about a house divided against itself. It's very hard to see how you bridge those kind of gaps. Not that I think Hillary actually believes that Republicans are her enemies, but I do think that the gap is now wide enough that it's very, very challenging to figure out how you talk together. And the way we interpret reality is that different. And that makes it that much harder to put things together. So I hope you'll find that useful as a background. Now, let me tell you briefly where I think we are. I believe that for conservative and most independent Americans, there is a deep, deep unhappiness with Washington at a level that we really have not seen since the Civil War. Gallup, who I work with, did a survey in Brazil. The Brazilians have an enormous scandal involving their government-run oil company, which has paid an estimated 40 billion, not million, $40 billion in bribes. Real money. 74% of the Brazilians believe that there's widespread corruption in a country which has had $40 billion in bribes. In the United States, the number is 75%. So 75% of the American people now look at Washington and they assume it's corrupt. It's really hard to run a free society with the cynicism that begins to build. And they think the fix is in. So you look at some other numbers. About 50% of the American people feel threatened by the federal government. See it literally as potentially their enemy, not their helper, not their ally, but a threat to their lives, a threat to their way of life, a threat to their freedoms. When the average American is asked how much waste is there in government, the answer is 51 cents out of every dollar. Now, the number's not real, but it gives you a flavor again of, if you're trying to talk to people about balancing the budget, and their assumption is you're wasting 51 cents out of every dollar, they wonder why it isn't easy to do. Just cut the waste in half. And so you have this huge and I think growing gap between a Washington establishment, which lives in a different world. 4 of the 5 wealthiest counties in the United States are in the Washington metropolitan area. So when the rest of the country goes into a recession, nobody in Washington notices it. When we talk about stagnant wages, nobody in Washington notices it. So you now have an imperial enclave of lobbyists and politicians and bureaucrats wondering why, and reporters and what have you, wondering why the rest of the country is being weird. And the gap grew big enough on the Republican side that 62% of Republicans said that they were unhappy with their leadership. In fact, the percent that said they were very happy was 2%. 2% is a statistical error. In that particular poll, that could have meant it was -2. And that's part of why you've now seen Eric Cantor, who was the majority leader, lose a race where he outspent his opponent by a massive number, something like 15 to 1. And he lost the race, by 60%. You then saw John Boehner put in a position where he couldn't stay as speaker. And Boehner, in my judgment, was a very decent, very hardworking guy who actually had grown the party to the largest number of members since 1928. We have 247 House Republicans, largest number since 1928. But it didn't matter. And then you had Kevin McCarthy from California, who I strongly supported and thought should be the next speaker. He couldn't get above 203 votes. And at that point, it hit me that this is not a personality problem. This is a deep systems problem. And what's happening is captured in the Republican presidential race. In the polls I saw this afternoon, you have Donald Trump first. You have Ben Carson second. The two of them are 48% of the vote. Now think about that. And then you drop to somebody at 8 or 9. And if you combine Trump, Carson, Fiorina, and Cruz is essentially an outsider who happens to be in the U.S. Senate, but he is so clearly not part of the U.S. Senate that he's probably more of an outsider than Trump, Carson, and Fiorina. You take those 4 together, they're at about 62%. Now, why is that? And of course, if you're in Washington, you think, boy, the voters are really stupid. Well, first of all, in a free society, it's very dangerous to say your customers are stupid because they're the customers. And the voters have the right to fire you. And I think something profound is going on. I think what you have, and this is on the conservative wing, on the liberal wing, You have a little bit of resentment, but they're basically liberals are more happy with the Obama administration by a big margin, as you might expect, than conservatives and independents are. So over here, you've got a liberal wing, which is a little bit unhappy because it wants to be even more liberal. So their favorite current emerging model with energy is Bernie Sanders, a man who honeymooned in the Soviet Union. That's really true. I did not make that up. And after all, if you're from Vermont, you want to go someplace with large trees and cold weather, you look around the map and you say, why not? But if you watch the debate the other night, I mean, Sanders has been on the Veterans Committee for years, watching the Veterans Administration fail bureaucratically, and so his answer for health care is to make the whole national system the Veterans Administration. Now, this is pure faith. This is the ideology of being able to avoid all information and stick to what you believe. But in the Democratic Party, it resonates. And one of the great challenges, and I'm not sure if you all have ever done a conference on this, but it's an interesting question. Ronald Reagan defeated communism in the Soviet Union, but did not defeat left-wing thought in America. It's one of the great, and I had no idea, if you had said to me in 1988, 1989, that we would be in the mess we're in today, I would not have thought it possible. Because it was so objectively clear that communism had failed as a model. And there's a famous story, which may be apocryphal, although I was told by a congressman who was in the room, that there's a faculty dinner at Stanford with Gorbachev after the fall of the Soviet Empire. And one of the faculty members explains that communism could have worked, that they just did it wrong in the Soviet Union. And after this guy goes to this lengthy explanation, Gorbachev stares at him and says, "You would have to be an American professor to believe that." Well, but what we didn't count on, if you think of the professors, the news media, the bureaucrats, most of the judges, and much of Hollywood is all being the same group. Okay, they all have the same combined group thought about how the planet should work. And so Sanders is the natural, if you've had 2 or 3 generations now of teaching young people and then keeping the ones who are the goofiest so that they could be tenured faculty members. And let me say, by the way, to this distinguished audience, many of you as alumni give money to institutions who teach your grandchildren to despise what you do. Now, you should think deeply about why you're doing that. I mean, that's an act of masochism on a national scale that's amazing. But people give $20 million grants to found a professorship, which is then, this happened recently by a Jewish family who founded a professorship which is now occupied by a person who's anti-Israel. This is not easy. Just as many of you have bought advertising in publications whose editorial page despises you. I mean, it's an amazing process. And so you end up over here with Sanders as sort of the natural byproduct of that, the evolution of the left. Over here, which have something very different, which is the repudiation of traditional republicanism. I mean, this is Goldwater and Reagan on a grand scale. And their vehicles is a very simple model, and Callista and I have talked about this because we have many very good friends running for office. And I mean, John Kasich was the Budget Committee chairman. He was the key to how we balanced the budget for 4 straight years. He's a brilliant guy. He's a great governor of Ohio. And in the last survey, he's at 3% or 4%. Marco Rubio is brilliant. I knew him back before he was Speaker of the House in Florida. Tremendous talent. He's at 8 or 9%. Jeb Bush was a very good governor of Florida. You can go down the list. All these folks, these are serious, solid people. And I think what's going on is a very simple conversation. It's like a job interview. They walk in and they say to the voter, "Hi, I have been in office and they cut them off. They go, "Well, not you. By definition, you're not going to be bold enough." And so you end up, if I came here tonight and all we had was Trump, I would say 2 things. I'd say, one, it could easily be a bubble. He could go away, and you have no way of knowing that he's going to last once you get to real votes. But since the person who's closest to him is Carson, the odds are pretty good if Trump collapsed that over half his vote would go to Carson, which would make Carson have more votes than Trump currently has. There's a second part to it. I can explain Donald. We know Donald reasonably well. He is Callista describes him as a reality show candidate. That he took the Apprentice model, applied it to being a candidate. People love reality shows, and you tune in every day to find out what he's done next. You know, this is like American Idol on steroids, and you know, and he has a perfect Kardashian era model. Whatever I tweeted last night isn't what I'm tweeting tonight, so why are you picking on me about last night? Because that was last night and I'm not there anymore. I'm over here now. And don't you understand? It can be great again. Okay? And people go, wow, that's cool. I mean, I'm with him. Because at least he's not boring. Okay? So I can explain Trump. Try to explain Carson. Carson comes on the stage and he is, and you saw him. He's very calm, he's very centered, he's very contained. He goes, hi. I'm going to say 2 or 3 amazingly radical things, which almost all of you will secretly agree with. But I'm going to say them so quietly that it'll only be Thursday when you begin to figure out what I said. And people watch him. I had this experience. At the first debate, somebody who's a reporter said to me, he watched and he thought, this guy is dead. His wife called him and said, I loved Ben Carson. He said, at that moment he knew there was something going on that had no relationship to anything. I was talking that night with somebody at Fox who's a very, very experienced student of this business, Charles Krauthammer. And Krauthammer said to me, he has concluded that he has to rethink everything he thought he knew because nothing that he thought he knew would have prepared him for the current campaign. And I think that's sort of, I think this is where I think the American people are smart. This is what propelled Goldwater when people were tired of the Republican establishment after 1960. It's what propelled Reagan, who was able to pick up Goldwater's momentum, but then transform it into a dramatically bigger, more positive, and more sophisticated movement. We're in a moment in time when people instinctively understand that you cannot fix what's wrong with small things. And they instinctively want somebody who's going to kick in the door and force profound change. Now, I will tell you flatly, I have no idea what that change will be like. In the case of Trump, I suggest to people, he is remarkably like Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson was a guy who threatened the entire establishment, won the office in a 4-year campaign after he came in first by a big margin, and the second and third guys ganged up on him in the Electoral College in Congress, and that was then described by Jackson's supporters as theft, and they spent 4 years destroying John Quincy Adams, and Jackson won the presidency. He was so disruptive that there's no good biography of him until 1945, because nobody in the establishment will write anything positive, because this is Andrew Jackson, who, by the way, in Callista's book, invites kids to the White House for a Christmas party in which they're given cotton balls instead of snowballs, and they have a cotton ball fight in the White House. So I see Trump as a little bit like Jackson. I'll give you an example of what I mean. Somebody said to me one day, you know, if Trump wins, he's going to pick up the phone, call Putin, and say, you're fired. And I said, that's just completely wrong. I said, you have to get his first big successful book, The Art of the Deal, and you have to look at how he thinks. He's going to call Putin. He's going to say, Vladimir, you're a mensch. I'm a mensch. This last guy, not much. We can deal. Personally, I'd like 3 hotels and a golf course in the Crimea. We'll put him in as an American program to show we're friends. You'll decide to be okay with us in Ukraine and quit messing around. We can be friends. We'll both be anti-terrorist. What do you think? Maybe get together, do a couple deals. You know, we have no idea what that would be like, because this is a guy who, in fact, has spent his whole life doing that kind of thing. And he's flexible. Now, then you have Carson. who's totally different. And people say, well, they don't have any, this is Washington talk. They're not experienced. In the case of Trump, he's made somewhere between $4 and $10 billion, depending on who you believe. Runs golf courses. He runs hotels. He runs casinos. He invented a tie line, which was the biggest selling tie in America. He has a top-rated NBC show, The Apprentice. He runs Miss Universe. He does all these things simultaneously, and they think he's not experienced because he didn't learn how to raise money from PACs and sit in back rooms talking to lobbyists. Except he was the lobbyist, so he was in the back room. Except it wasn't a back room, it was his front room because people came to him. So think about this, okay? So this is Trump. Then you get to Carson, and people go, what does he know? Ben Carson, whose personal story is unbelievable, single mother. I first heard Carson at the prayer breakfast, I think in 1993. And he was amazing. And he started by citing part of the brain, so using the scientific language, and saying, oh, but none of you knew what that meant because you're not neurosurgeons. He said, I know what it meant, not because I'm black, but because I studied. And then he started talking, and he talked about his mother, and he said, they had a rule when he was a child. If either he or his brother got a B, either one, the TV went in the closet until the next grading session. And he said, friends say to him, how could she do that? And I tell her, she thought she was the mother. So this guy comes along. At 33 years of age, he becomes the youngest department head in the history of Johns Hopkins. He performs a world record operation separating Siamese twins in 20 hours of operation with a 70-person team. And folks in Washington say, yeah, but what are his real experiences? What would he do in a crisis? You don't think hour 18 operating on these two twins was like, he's pretty good at crises. He's just not good at Washington crises. So I think it's going to be a fascinating period. I have no idea what's going to happen, but I have a very Reagan-like belief in the American people. And I've noticed that over our entire history, starting with the American Revolution, dictators and kings have often thought that we were easy and soft and could be beaten. I remember in the 1980s when we had books like Japan is Number One and the Emerging Japanese Superstate. That all happened just before the crash of the Nikkei and the clash of property values in 1988, 89. I remember Khrushchev pounding his shoe at the UN and saying he was going to bury us. There's a great story about Khrushchev, who Eisenhower is invited to visit the U.S. because he wants him to get some experience outside of Russia. Flies in, looks out over Manhattan and says to his staff, these Americans are very clever. They have brought all the cars in the country to New York to impress me. So I honestly believe, and you'll see this with the new Steve Jobs movie, the number one thing people should say about the Clinton, Obama, Sanders model is you'd never get Steve Jobs. You'd never get Bill Gates. You'd never get Zuckerberg. You'd never get Henry Ford. You'd never get Thomas Edison. You have to have a society open to talent, open to risk, willing to have people go broke as long as they get back up and try again. We have had that society for 400 years. It's the most successful integrator of humans in the history of the human race. And I don't think the American people are going to give that up for some academic baloney from people who can't do anything. So I'm an optimist that we'll get there. Who's going to be leading us, I'm not sure of. How we're going to get there and what the path will look like, I'm not sure of. But I'm absolutely certain the American people will not satisfy for giving up the dream in order to live in some soft socialist basket where they don't have any ability to do anything great or to achieve anything. So, John, can we take questions a little bit?
So as Speaker Gingrich has said, he's got just a few minutes to take questions in. One thing I'll ask is we have staff in the aisles, as you can see them here, with microphones. If you could wait until the microphone's in your hand, so because you're on TV and we need to hear you. So if we could start right here. Yeah.
You probably knew or figured somebody's going to ask you this question, but with the current situation of Speaker of the House in flux, with your experience, with your ability of working within your own party and across party lines, is this something that you would give some thought to for the good of your country, and also being in a position where you don't need to worry about the next election, where you can actually do what's best for the country?
Well, Callista and I have obviously talked about it, and we both worked in the House, we both love the House. I think it's highly impractical. First of all, I think Paul Ryan has announced that he is willing to accept it. I think they'll work it out, and probably by this weekend or next week, he'll be clearly the unanimous choice for Speaker. I think he's probably the brightest policy guy in the House, in either party. But I don't think, I'm very happy to advise members and I work with lots of members on lots of topics. I don't think it's a practical matter that you can go in and be an outsider and lead the House. I mean, for one thing, you insult the 15 or 20 people who think they could be Speaker because they wonder how come you, when they're still serving. And then second, you just need the ground reality of going back home and having to deal with constituents. And I mean, these are very hard jobs. But I'm very happy to be an advisor and to be a planner and a consultant. And we do a lot of that. I was doing some today by telephone.
Questions? Right over here. Here and here.
Thank you, Mr. Gingrich. You told us about, Trump and Carson. I would be interested in what your thought is of Cruz and his appeal and what you make of that.
Well,
Because for me, it's all about Trump, Carson, and Cruz. And I know a lot of Americans think that.
Yeah, and it could also be about Fiorina, who had a remarkably good debate. Cruz is extraordinarily smart. Callista and I had a long dinner with him before he decided to run, and talked through a whole range of issues. He is very methodically gone out and raised a lot more money than people thought he would. He has done a very good job of not spending it. So he actually has a pretty good bit of money on hand. And he is putting together a coalition that's a very interesting combination of people who are evangelicals and people who are libertarians and people who are traditional conservatives. And people who are just fed up with the way the system currently works. So I would say if Trump and Carson falter, that he is the most likely person to gain from that happening. He's a very formidable debater, was a national debate champion, and he's intellectually very, very smart. But now he does have the downside, as you may have noticed over the weekend, President George W. Bush said he just plain doesn't like him. And I can assure you that probably 40 of the senators would applaud George W. Bush on the Republican side. So he has a knack for being very strong and very loud and standing on what he believes in a way that sort of maximizes people being irritated with him. And that's a part of the balance. But he has done very well, better than I thought he would, frankly. And I think you have to consider him a serious contender, and that's why I always list him as one of the four outsiders. I mean, I think, and he clearly is an outsider. He is not in any way an insider in the Senate.
I think we had another right here.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, thank you for being here. As a college student myself, I'm subjected to the liberal professors, on a daily basis. So what advice would you give to young Republicans in college, every day who are dealing with that, how to combat that and how to go out in the community and do more?
What I would actually urge young Republicans to do in college is have the courage to take on their professors. And every time the professor says something that is utterly stupid, challenge it. And every time they start to punish you for having challenged it, threaten a lawsuit. People need to remember, freedom is not given. Freedom is earned. And we need a generation of young people prepared to stand up and earn their freedom by taking on an establishment which is profoundly wrong about the nature of the world and says things that are profoundly dishonest as a matter of fact.
I think right over here.
I was just wondering, in the wake of like recent shootings and different violence, I was wondering your opinion if you think that guns should be more controlled, or if you think that, what is your opinion on that?
I recommend to everybody who asks about that they read a book by Bill Fortune, who was my co-author for a whole series of novels. It's called Days of Wrath, and it is a horrifying short novel about ISIS deciding to launch an assault on American schools. And the reason I say that is I personally believe every school should have some people who have been trained and are armed, and that the first reaction should be, candidly, to shoot the person who's dangerous. I think this idea... and again, you have to start from a very simple model. I mean, the British now have a proposal to outlaw long knives on the grounds that because the British have much greater gun control than we do, so that knives are used in a very substantial number of British English killings. So, the British Medical Society has proposed that knives beyond a certain length, these are kitchen knives, I'm not talking about Bowie knives or hunting knives, that knives beyond a certain length be outlawed because there's no reason you really need to have them, and they're dangerous, etc. Well, I don't think that works in the long run. I mean, I think you have to protect yourself against evil, not try to eliminate all of the tools. You know, and that's just my personal view.
Right here in the center. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for choosing me. My name is Victor Cornejo, and I wanted to hear about your opinion over John Kasich's immigration stance, considering yours, about securing the border and also allowing for the 11 to 12 million immigrants a path to legalization. What are your thoughts over that?
Yeah, well, my personal view is that one, we have a national security reason to control the border. And that includes, by the way, some kind of accurate verification of people who come to the U.S. with visas, because 40% of the people who are here illegally came legally with visas and then just stayed. So let's be clear, it's not just about crossing the border. But I do think you have a technical national security reason to want to have control of your border and know who's in the country. Second, I'm different than a lot of Republicans in that I think, and I said this in the 2012 campaign, I think it is utterly impractical to think that you are going to have people self-deport or have people, you know, grandmothers aren't going to self-deport. They're not going to leave their grandchildren. And so I think we've got to find a path to legality, which is not the same as a path to citizenship. And I would say, and the reason I say that is, you want to bring everybody in from the gray zone. You want to expel, and we need to reform our expulsion rules. So if somebody belongs to MS-13 or any other gang or is a felon, you can get rid of them rapidly. You don't have to go through a 3-year process. But I would then say to you that people who are allowed to stay come within the law, and they have to get behind people who obeyed the law back home in order to apply for citizenship. You cannot establish the precedent that there are two brothers, one of whom broke the law to come in here illegally 5 years ago, the other of whom has patiently waited in their native country, and we're now going to reward the guy who broke the law. I mean, that would be, because part of what it'll do is it'll guarantee the next wave of people who break the law. So I think that we have to find a solution. It has to be real, it has to be practical, but it has to establish the rule of law, and it has to be pretty aggressive. And I think people would have to pay some kind of penalty in order to come within legality. Now, you could pay it over, say, 5 years, but I think there ought to be a fairly substantial penalty in order to become legal, because these people have broken the law coming in.
We've got time for one last question, and then we'll come right over here.
For my son's sake, I dream of America being a debt-free nation someday. Do you ever envision something like that?
I'm sorry, I couldn't quit you.
Debt-free nation. Can you ever envision a country?
Debt-free nation?
Debt-free, yeah.
Well, it's very funny. When we passed the balanced budgets, when I was Speaker, we passed a law which led to 4 consecutive balanced budgets. By 1999, Jack Lew, who is now the Secretary of the Treasury, was then the Director of the Budget, and reported that at the rate we were going, we would pay off the national debt in the summer of 2008. And Alan Greenspan was worried as chair of the Fed about how you would manage the money supply if you had no U.S. bonds, because the government was debt-free. Now, we've only ever been debt-free one time. It was in 1837. It was promptly followed by a bank panic. And there is actually a theoretical argument for some modest amount of debt as a way of managing cash flow and managing the currency. But my answer is sure. Of course you can imagine becoming a debt-free country. It would require very bold changes. It would require thinking differently. All the things that both Carson and Trump are talking about. But you reestablish the work ethic. People don't get things for free. You establish the rules that if you're a crook, we're going to come after you. I think at least $200 billion a year is stolen in the federal government. That's a modest start in the direction of getting to a balanced budget. You go through and apply common sense. You open up a fair amount of federal land for exploration for oil and gas and what have you. You take the properties that HUD owns that they can't manage and you put them back on the market so that people can move into the houses and actually live in them and neighborhoods get better. There are lots of things you could do that over a 5 or 8 year period would get you to a balanced budget. And over the next 10 or 12 years would actually get you to a very, very modest national debt, which I think would be possible. The British did it in the 19th century. We did it after the Civil War. We did it after World War I. We did it after World War II. You pay down the debt, and we could do that. One of the examples I'll give you where we have to rethink from the ground up, this entire student loan program is crazy. Student loans actually lengthen the amount of time students spend in school. Means that they graduate owing a debt which reshapes the rest of their life. There's a dramatic decline in entrepreneurship, starting small businesses, because people owe so much debt coming out of college. This is exactly the wrong model. What we ought to have is a model that says we're going to help you work your way through school so you graduate debt-free, so you can actually do the things that you want to do because you actually believe in them. And there are some schools like this. The College of the Ozarks, you cannot go to the College of the Ozarks unless you need federal aid, and they have no federal aid. You work 20 hours a week during the school year, 40 hours a week during the summer. It pays all room and board, all tuition, all books. 93% of the students graduate with no debt, and the 7% who graduate with debt because they bought a car their senior year. Now, it's a totally different model, which I think is a healthier model, but would actually require you telling your young student, your sons and daughters, that work is an acceptable part of how one gets through life. And this is something they have to confront sooner or later, so I happen to think it's a useful kind of model. Let me close with just one comment on why Callista and I are always so grateful when we have a chance to come out here. This is an institution which is keeping alive one of the spiritual and intellectual giants of American government and politics. Ronald Reagan changed the world, and he changed the world with ideas and with language. And it was an extraordinary change. Now, he didn't solve everything, just as Lincoln didn't solve everything, and Washington didn't solve everything. But he sure moved us a long distance. And I think for as long as this institution is faithful to studying and teaching about Ronald Reagan, it will be a beacon of hope that people can come to and can look at and come online to and can actually learn that it is possible for free people to once again create anew. Thank you all very, very much.
Well done, Mr. Speaker. Excellent, excellent. We're going to head out this way with Deb Callista.
Ladies and gentlemen, the team of Gingrich and Gingrich has agreed to sign books up in the gift store. If you'll give us a